The dinner invitation arrived on an ordinary evening, which somehow made it worse. Nothing dramatic announced it, no raised voices, no tension in the air. Just my wife standing in the kitchen, holding her phone with both hands, reading a message twice as if the meaning might change if she stared long enough. The ceiling fan hummed softly above us. The smell of cooked rice still lingered. Life was calm in the way it often is right before it isn't. "My brother wants us there," she said finally, trying to sound casual. Then, after a pause that carried more weight than the words themselves, she added, "He wants you there too." She looked up at me then, searching my face for a reaction I had learned long ago not to give too easily. I nodded, not because I felt agreement, but because nodding required less explanation, less defense, less effort. Family gatherings always came with an aftertaste, metallic, sharp, like you'd bitten your tongue and decided pretending it didn't hurt was the better option. They were places where conversations were measured, where silence was praised as maturity, and where discomfort was reframed as misunderstanding. If something stung, you were expected to swallow it quietly and call it love. I had learned those rules early. My wife's brother had always been charming in the way that made people forgive him before he ever apologized. Recently, he'd started bringing someone new around, a girlfriend, new energy, new confidence, new eyes scanning the room, deciding who mattered and who didn't. I already suspected where I would fall on that list. "You don't have to come if you don't want to," she said, though her voice betrayed the lie. In families like hers, absence was a statement, and statements were never forgiven. "It's fine," I replied. The words came out automatically, polished by years of practice. "We'll go." She smiled with relief, but it was a fragile smile, the kind that knows it's borrowing time. She turned back to the stove, stirring something that didn't need stirring, and I stayed where I was, staring at nothing in particular. I thought about past dinners, about the way conversations flowed easily around me, but rarely toward me, about how jokes were made about me and never with me, about how being quiet had somehow been translated as being lesser, as if volume alone determined value. There was a time when I tried harder, when I spoke more, when I explained myself, but explanations, I learned, were invitations for correction. Silence, at least, couldn't be twisted as easily. Later that night, as we got ready for bed, my wife lingered in front of the mirror longer than usual. She adjusted her earrings twice, smoothed her hair. She was nervous, though she would never say it. She lived her life balancing between roles, daughter, sister, wife, each one pulling at her from a different direction. "You'll be okay, right?" she asked quietly, still not looking at me. I met her eyes in the mirror. "I always am." She nodded, accepting the answer because she needed to, because believing it made everything simpler. But lying in bed afterwards, staring at the ceiling in the dark, I knew what okay really meant. It meant enduring. It meant letting things slide. It meant choosing peace over pride and calling it wisdom. It meant being the kind of man people praised for being calm, while they tested just how calm he could remain. Sleep came slowly. The next evening, as we drove to her family's house, the streetlights passed in steady intervals, like a countdown. I watched my reflection flicker in the window, present, quiet, already bracing. My wife talked about traffic, about food, about nothing at all. We were both avoiding the same thought. When we arrived, laughter spilled out before the door even opened. Warm lights, familiar voices, the performance of belonging already underway. Inside, hugs were exchanged, compliments passed around. Then she appeared, the girlfriend, confident posture, easy smile. She wore comfort like it was custom-made, like the room had been waiting for her specifically. Her eyes landed on me briefly, just long enough to assess, to calculate, then they moved on.
That single glance told me everything I needed to know. This dinner wasn't about food or family or connection. It was about hierarchy. I took my seat at the table, folded my hands, and prepared myself the way I always did. Not with anger, not with fear, but with a quiet resolve to observe, to endure, to survive the evening without giving anyone a reason to accuse me of making things uncomfortable. Because in rooms like this, discomfort was only unacceptable when it came from the wrong person. And tonight, I already knew exactly who that would be.
Dinner began the way these things always did. Too loud, too cheerful, as if volume itself could drown out tension. Plates were passed, chairs scraped against the floor, and everyone spoke at once until a rhythm formed, a familiar chaos that felt rehearsed rather than natural. She sat across from me. My wife's brother's new girlfriend leaned back comfortably in her chair, elbows loose, posture open, like she owned the space simply by existing in it. She laughed easily, the kind of laugh that invited agreement even when nothing particularly funny had been said. People responded to her instinctively. Heads turned, smiles followed. She was good at this. I noticed how she spoke, decisive, confident, each sentence landing like it expected to be received well. She talked about restaurants she liked, places she'd been, opinions she held firmly. No hesitation, no self-doubt. The family listened with interest, nodding along, eager to mirror her certainty. Then, slowly, her attention drifted toward me. Not directly, not yet. First it came in glances, brief, measuring looks that lasted just a second too long to be accidental. Her eyes moved over my clothes, my posture, the way I sat quietly while others spoke. I recognized that look immediately. It wasn't curiosity, it was evaluation. And I failed it. "So," she said suddenly, turning to my wife, "he's always this quiet?" The laughter lightly tittered, not cruelly, at least not openly, just enough to suggest the comment was harmless, just enough to make it awkward to challenge. My wife smiled politely. "He's thoughtful," she replied. The girlfriend tilted her head, amused. "That's one way to put it." Her eyes flicked back to me. This time she smiled directly, but there was nothing warm in it. It was the kind of smile people use when they're already forming conclusions. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the instinct to explain myself, to correct the impression before it hardened. But I stayed silent. I'd learned that defending yourself in rooms like this only confirmed what people already wanted to believe. Conversation moved on, but something had shifted. She began including me in subtle ways, not to engage, but to observe. A question asked without waiting for an answer, a glance shared with someone else after I spoke, as if to silently comment on what I'd said. "So what do you do again?" she asked at one point, swirling her drink. I answered simply, briefly, enough to be polite. "Oh," she said, drawing the word out. "That must be stable." The pause after the word carried weight. The implication settled neatly into the space she left for it. Again, laughter. Softer this time, more cautious, the kind of laughter people use when they're unsure whether they should be laughing at all, but do it anyway to avoid standing out. I noticed how no one looked at me afterward. Eyes dropped to plates, drinks were sipped, silence smoothed over the moment like a cloth over a stain. I focused on eating, on the texture of food that suddenly tasted like nothing. I reminded myself of the unspoken rule. Don't react. Don't give them anything to point at. Across the table, she was thriving. She leaned into my wife's brother, touching his arm when she spoke, drawing him into her orbit. He watched her with admiration, clearly pleased. This was someone he could be proud of, someone impressive, someone who elevated him simply by association. I wondered, briefly, if he noticed what she was doing. Probably not. People rarely see cruelty when it wears charm so convincingly. At one point, she leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. "You know," she said, addressing the table, "I really admire families like this, so close. Everyone knows their place." Her eyes met mine as she said the last words.
The moment was quick, almost invisible, but it landed exactly where she intended. I felt my wife stiffen beside me. Her fingers brushed mine under the table, a silent question, a warning, an apology all at once. I gave her hand a gentle squeeze, reassuring her more than myself. "It's fine," the gesture said. But it wasn't. Not because the comments hurt. I'd endured worse. It wasn't even because of her confidence. What unsettled me was how easily the room adjusted around her, how quickly she learned where the soft spots were and pressed them without leaving fingerprints. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't insult me outright, she simply positioned herself above me, step by careful step, while everyone else watched and called it conversation. As dinner went on, the jokes grew slightly sharper, though still disguised as teasing, about my quietness, about my simple tastes, about how some people preferred stability over ambition. Each time she glanced at me afterward, checking for a reaction. Each time I gave her none. But something was changing inside me. Not anger, not humiliation. Awareness, the kind that settles quietly, like a piece clicking into place. She thought I was harmless. She thought silence meant ignorance, that restraint meant lack of depth, that sitting back meant I had nothing worth bringing forward. I watched her carefully then, not with resentment, but with interest. I noticed how often she looked around after speaking, seeking approval, how her confidence depended on the room agreeing with her, how she needed witnesses. People like that, I knew, were strongest when they believed they were untouchable. The thought didn't make me smile. It made me patient. By the time dessert was served, the atmosphere felt different, lighter on the surface, heavier underneath. The hierarchy had been established, at least in her mind. I was placed neatly where she believed I belonged. Across from me, she laughed again, carefree, unchallenged. She had no idea that first impressions, like smiles, could fade. And when they did, they rarely returned the same way.
The shift was subtle, almost polite. That was the most dangerous part of it. The girlfriend no longer tested the room, she used it. The earlier glances and half comments had done their work. By now, she knew exactly how far she could go without being questioned. It started with laughter that arrived a second too early. When I spoke, she smiled before I finished, as if she already knew where my words were going and found them mildly amusing. When I stayed silent, she filled the space for me, summarizing my thoughts with an exaggerated gentleness that made it sound like she was helping. "He's more of a listener," she said once, waving a hand in my direction. "Not everyone needs to talk all the time, right?" The comment floated in the air, light and harmless on the surface. The table nodded, someone chuckled, the moment passed, officially inoffensive. Unofficially, something inside me tightened. I noticed how the family began mirroring her behavior. My wife's cousin repeated one of her jokes almost word for word. An uncle smirked when I hesitated before answering a question. Even neutral remarks now carried a faint edge, as if my presence had been quietly redefined. This wasn't bullying. That would have required intent that could be called out. This was permission. At some point, she asked me a question directly, not about my work, not about my interests, about something trivial, how often I visited, whether I liked the food. I answered calmly, briefly. She nodded, then laughed. "See, that's what I mean. So, minimal." The word hung there longer than it should have. I opened my mouth to respond, not defensively, not angrily, just honestly. But before I could, a voice from the side cut in. "Let's not," my wife's aunt said softly, though the message was firm. "We're all having a nice evening." The room stilled. Eyes shifted. The girlfriend leaned back, satisfied but careful to look innocent. I understood then that the correction wasn't meant for her. It was meant for me. Another voice followed, lower, closer. "Please don't make this awkward," someone murmured. "Don't make the whole family look bad." There it was, the verdict delivered gently like advice so it could pretend to be kindness. I closed my mouth. The conversation resumed immediately, relief spreading through the room now that the threat of discomfort had been neutralized. People talked louder, laughed more freely, as if the interruption had never happened. I sat there invisible in the most visible way possible. Beside me, my wife shifted uneasily. I could feel her tension without looking. She wanted to say something, I knew that, but she was outnumbered, not just by people, but by history, by expectation, by the unspoken rule that peace mattered more than fairness. I placed my hand over hers briefly, a small signal. It's okay, or at least, don't sacrifice yourself for this. The girlfriend watched the gesture with mild interest, then returned to her drink. With the family's quiet approval, she grew bolder. Her jokes no longer paused to check the room. They flowed freely now, confident they would land safely. She referenced me casually, like a fixed object, something predictable. "Some people just don't like attention," she said once, glancing at me, "or responsibility." This time the laughter was louder. Something hardened in my chest, not into anger, but resolute. A clear understanding of the structure I was sitting inside. This wasn't about me personally. I was convenient. I was the example that allowed everyone else to feel aligned. I thought about speaking up again, about calmly correcting her, about stating plainly that her assumptions were wrong. But I didn't, because I saw something else now. I saw how invested she was in being admired, how carefully she curated her image, how much she relied on the family's agreement to maintain her position. And I realized something important. People who need an audience are vulnerable to silence and to truth. So I stayed quiet, not of weakness, but choice. I let the jokes continue. I let the room settle into its comfort. I let her believe she had won something. Across the table, she smiled easily, unaware that confidence built on borrowed ground collapses the moment the foundation is questioned. The family thought the evening had stabilized. They believed the tension had passed. They were wrong. This wasn't the end of the discomfort. It was the moment it became useful.
By the time the main dishes were cleared, the room had settled into a rhythm that no longer required effort. The tension hadn't disappeared. It had simply been absorbed. Laughter came easier now, unchallenged, and the girlfriend moved through the conversation like someone certain of her footing. I had become background. That realization didn't sting the way it once might have. Instead, it clarified things. Being overlooked meant being unexamined, and being unexamined meant being free to observe without interference. She sat comfortably at the center of attention, legs crossed, one arm draped along the back of my wife's brother's chair. She spoke about her preferences, her experiences, the kinds of people she admired. Each statement landed with confidence, reinforced by nods and murmurs of agreement. Occasionally, she glanced my way, not to include me, but to check that I was still where she had placed me. I was. Someone asked about work schedules, another about travel plans. The conversation drifted, but each time it passed near me, it curved away at the last second, like water around a stone. When I did speak, responses came delayed, polite, as if acknowledging a minor interruption. At one point, my wife's cousin turned to me and smiled. "You don't say much, do you?" It wasn't a question. Before I could answer, the girlfriend laughed softly. "Some people are just comfortable in the background." Background. The words settled in the room and stayed. I felt my wife's gaze on me. She was waiting, watching for the moment I might finally react, might defend myself, might force her to choose between me and her family. I didn't want that for her, not tonight. So I smiled, a small one, neutral, non-threatening. The girlfriend accepted it as confirmation. She continued, more relaxed now. "Honestly, it's refreshing," she said. "Not everyone needs to stand out." The irony went unnoticed.
As dessert was brought out, the energy lifted further. People leaned back in their chairs, glasses were refilled. The evening had reached the stage where honesty often slipped out disguised as humor. She told a story about colleagues she didn't respect, mocking his hesitation, his lack of confidence. The description felt uncomfortably familiar. She didn't look at me while she spoke, but she didn't need to. Everyone laughed. I watched her carefully now, the way her smile widened when people reacted, the way her posture straightened with each approving sound. Her confidence wasn't self-contained. It was fed, constantly. That was when I understood the nature of my role. I wasn't just being diminished. I was being used as contrast. My quiet made her louder. My restraint made her boldness impressive. My endurance made her behavior appear harmless. The family's comfort depended on someone absorbing the discomfort, and that someone was me. The realization didn't anger me. It focused me. I stopped listening to the words and started listening to the patterns. Who laughed first? Who followed? Who avoided eye contact? Who looked relieved when I didn't respond? Across from me, she picked up her phone briefly, checking a message, then set it face down on the table with deliberate care, as if reminding everyone she had a life beyond this room. My wife's brother leaned closer to her, whispering something that made her smile again. She was winning, or at least she thought she was. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled slowly. The weight I'd been carrying all evening shifted. Endurance, I realized, wasn't passive. It was an active decision to wait. Because moments like this always contained a turning point. People who speak freely eventually reveal what they value most. People who feel safe eventually boast. And boasting, I knew, was never as harmless as it sounded. As the conversation drifted again, she began talking about ambition, about how important it was to do something meaningful with your life, about how some people settled too easily. Her eyes flicked to me briefly this time, a challenge, or an invitation. I didn't take it. Instead, I watched her lean forward, energized, warming to her own voice. The family listened closely now. This was her stage. And stages, I had learned, were fragile things. All it took was the wrong spotlight in the wrong moment to change how the audience saw everything. I folded my hands on the table and waited. Not for permission, for timing. Because endurance only looks like weakness to those who don't understand patience. And patience, when paired with truth, always outlasts performance.
The shift came the way it always does, without announcement. One moment, the conversation wandered lazily, looping through safe topics and shared memories. The next, it tightened, drawn toward something shinier, something designed to impress. She straightened in her chair as someone asked about work. It wasn't a direct question at first, just a passing comment about how busy everyone seemed these days, how demanding modern jobs had become. Most people answered vaguely, offering complaints and half-jokes. She didn't. "Oh, I don't mind the pressure," she said, smiling easily. "I actually thrive in it." The room leaned in almost imperceptibly. This was the tone everyone recognized, the prelude to a story worth listening to. She began talking about her job with practiced ease, describing long hours, high expectations, and the kind of responsibility that came with being trusted. Her words were polished, arranged carefully to sound effortless while carrying weight. "I'm lucky. Not everyone gets to work somewhere that actually matters." A few approving murmurs followed. Someone nodded appreciatively. My wife's brother watched her with clear pride, his chest lifting slightly as if her accomplishments reflected directly on him. She glanced at me then. It was quick, subtle, but intentional. A check-in, a reminder of the contrast she was building.
I remained still. Encouraged, she went on, now naming the company, the position, the level she operated at. She spoke as if the title itself conferred authority beyond the office, as if it should carry over into this room and rearrange the seating. I worked hard to get there. You really have to know people, be sharp, be aware. The implications settled neatly into the space she left open. The family responded exactly as she expected. Questions followed, interest sparked, people leaned closer, impressed not just with what she did, but how confidently she claimed it. I noticed how she relaxed as the attention gathered around her, how her shoulders loosened, how her voice grew louder. Confidence, when fed, grows hungry. She laughed lightly. It's not for everyone, of course. Some people prefer simpler paths, less pressure. Again, her eyes flicked toward me. This time, someone else laughed first, a cousin, an aunt. The laughter spread, comfortable now, justified by her success. After all, she had earned the right to say these things. I felt the familiar weight press down, the expectation that I would absorb the comment, that I would keep the evening smooth by not disrupting it with truth. And I did. But something inside me had gone very still. She was no longer just mocking me. She was defining herself, declaring what she valued, revealing the foundation her confidence stood on. That mattered. She continued, describing a recent project, dropping names, emphasizing stakes. She spoke of meetings where decisions were made, of people who listened when she spoke. I guess I'm just not used to holding back, she said with a playful shrug. When you're used to being taken seriously, it becomes second nature. The table hummed with approval. Pride radiated from her like heat. I watched her closely now, not with irritation, but with clarity. I saw how much she needed this, how deeply she relied on the idea that her job made her unassailable, that it placed her above critique. She believed her position was solid. That belief was her mistake, because while she spoke, I remembered details, connections, context, information I had never felt the need to share, not because it was secret, but because it had never been relevant, until now. I thought of the phone in my pocket. I hadn't planned to use it tonight. I hadn't planned anything at all. But plans, I'd learned, weren't always necessary when truth was already waiting. She finished her story to scattered applause. Someone praised her ambition. Someone else joked about how intimidating she must be at work. She smiled graciously, accepting it all. Then, leaning back, she said lightly, "It's nice being respected. Not everyone gets that." The words landed, deliberate and clean. That was the moment. Not because she had crossed a line, she'd crossed many already, but because she had finally revealed everything she was staking her worth on. I slipped my hand into my pocket. Not yet, but soon, because confidence built on titles and assumptions has a way of unraveling when faced with facts, and she had just given me all the permission I needed.
For a moment after her last remark, the room held its breath without realizing it. The laughter faded into a low hum of conversation, softer now, as if everyone sensed something had shifted but couldn't name it. Plates sat half-finished, glasses rested untouched. She looked pleased, comfortable, untouchable. I didn't move right away. I let the silence stretch just long enough to feel natural, long enough that no one could later say I'd acted impulsively. Timing mattered. It always had. Then I reached into my pocket. The movement was small, unremarkable, no sudden gestures, no drama, just the quiet, ordinary act of taking out a phone. But even small movements draw attention when a room is already leaning forward. I unlocked the screen slowly. The soft glow lit my hands, then my face. I felt eyes drift toward me, curiosity replacing amusement. She noticed last. Her smile faltered just a fraction when she saw where the attention had gone. Not fear yet, just confusion. Why was I suddenly doing something worth watching? I placed the phone on the table, face up. The sound it made, A gentle tap against the wood felt louder than it should have. Conversations trailed off. Someone cleared their throat. No one laughed. I didn't say a word. On the screen was nothing flashy, no insults, no opinions, just information. Names, dates, a company logo, a familiar title, the kind of details that mean nothing unless you understand what you're looking at. She leaned forward slightly, still smiling, expecting a joke. "What's that?" she asked lightly. I met her eyes for the first time all evening. "Just something you mentioned," I said. The room stilled. She glanced down at the phone. At first, nothing changed. Her expression remained confident, curious at most. Then her eyes moved again, slower this time. She read, once, then again. The color drained from her face. It happened gradually, like a photograph losing saturation. Her smile tightened, then froze, then disappeared altogether. Her posture shifted, shoulders pulling inward, chin lifting defensively. "That's not what it looks like," she said quickly, though no one had accused her of anything. I said nothing. Around us, the family leaned in now, drawn by the sudden gravity in the room. Someone asked quietly what was going on. No one answered. She looked at my wife's brother, then back at the screen, then at me. Panic flickered beneath the surface of her composure. "You shouldn't have that," she said sharper than before. I raised my eyebrow. "It's public." That single word landed harder than any accusation could have. She swallowed. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her glass, then thought better of it and set it down again. The family began to piece things together, murmurs spreading like cracks through glass. Names were recognized, context formed. What she had presented as authority now looked different, smaller, conditional. A lie didn't have to be spoken to be exposed. Sometimes exaggeration was enough. "I can explain," she said too quickly. Still, I said nothing. Explanation, I knew, was what people asked for when the truth was already clear but uncomfortable. She looked around the table, searching for support, for someone to laugh, to diffuse the moment, to tell her this was nothing. But no one did. The same people who had laughed earlier now avoided her eyes. Power had shifted, quietly, completely. My wife's brother finally spoke, his voice uncertain. "Is this accurate?" She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Whatever she'd been prepared to say no longer fit the room she was standing in. I picked up my phone and slid it back into my pocket. "I didn't mean to interrupt. You were talking about respect." Silence. The word hung between us, heavy and unmistakable. Her confidence had evaporated, replaced with something brittle. She sat rigid, hands clasped tightly together, her gaze fixed on the table. No one laughed now. I leaned back in my chair, the weight I'd been carrying all evening finally lifting, not because I'd embarrassed her, but because I'd stopped carrying something that was never mine to bear. The family would remember this moment differently, each of them. Some would feel guilt, others discomfort, a few might resent me. That didn't matter. What mattered was that the room had learned something important. Silence wasn't weakness, and respect wasn't something you claimed. It was something you earned, or lost, the moment you tried to stand on someone else to reach it. No one spoke at first. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was crowded, filled with thoughts no one wanted to claim out loud. Chairs creaked as people shifted in their seats, suddenly aware of their posture, their expressions, their earlier laughter. She sat very still. The girlfriend's hands were folded tightly in her lap now, knuckles pale, as if holding herself together required physical effort. The confidence she'd worn so comfortably, it slipped away, leaving behind something fragile and exposed. Her eyes avoided the phone's former place on the table, as though looking there might make everything real again. Someone cleared their throat. Another reached for a glass, then set it back down untouched. The family, so vocal moments earlier, had become careful. I watched it all with a detached calm that surprised even me. I hadn't planned for this exact outcome, but I recognized it. I'd seen it before, in other rooms, other situations. When authority collapses, people don't rush to fill the void, they retreat from it. My wife's brother was the first to break the silence. "So," he began, then stopped. The word failed him. He glanced at her, then at me, uncertainty written plainly across his face. The admiration he'd worn earlier had dulled, replaced with something closer to confusion. She reached for his arm instinctively, but he didn't respond the way he had before. His body stayed still, a fraction too distant. The space between them felt suddenly larger. "I told you it wasn't like that," she said softly, almost pleading. The tone was new, stripped of performance, stripped of control. "You know how people misunderstand things." No one answered. I noticed how the family avoided looking at me now, not out of disregard, but discomfort. It's hard to meet the eyes of someone you misjudged so thoroughly. Aunties whispered to each other in low voices. A cousin stared at the table, jaw tight. Someone laughed nervously, then stopped when no one joined in. The room felt rearranged, though no furniture had moved. My wife shifted beside me, her shoulder brushing mine. She leaned closer, not to speak, but to exist alongside me. Her presence was quiet but firm, support without spectacle. I realized then that the moment wasn't about humiliation, not really. It was about exposure, of her, yes, but also of everyone else. Of the laughter that came too easily, of the silence that had been demanded of me, of the comfort people found in letting someone else be the target. She tried again. "I just wanted to fit in," she said, her voice catching. "I didn't mean—" "Enough," someone said gently, not unkindly, just tired. The word landed softly, but carried finality. She nodded, swallowing hard. The performance was over. There was no role left for her to play. Conversation resumed, but it was different now. Careful, fragmented. Topics shifted abruptly, as if everyone were afraid of touching something sharp. No one addressed what happened directly. They didn't need to. My wife's brother stayed quiet, his eyes fixed somewhere far away. Every so often he glanced at her, then looked away again. Whatever certainty he'd walked in with had fractured. I noticed how she stopped laughing entirely, how she spoke only when spoken to, her words measured, cautious. The room no longer rewarded her confidence, so she abandoned it. The hierarchy she'd built had collapsed, and with it, the permission to speak freely at someone else's expense. Across the table, my wife's cousin finally looked at me, really looked at me. There was something like apology in her eyes, though she didn't say anything. I didn't need her to. I hadn't won anything, I'd simply stopped losing. As the evening wound down, people began checking the time, making excuses, standing up sooner than planned. The energy had drained, leaving behind something quieter and more honest. She gathered her things carefully, avoiding my gaze entirely now. When she stood, she swayed slightly, catching herself on the back of the chair. My wife's brother reached out automatically, then hesitated, his hand stopping just short of her arm. That hesitation said more than any argument could have. At the door, she paused, forcing a small smile for the room. It didn't reach her eyes. "Nice meeting you," she said, to no one in particular. No one answered. After the door closed behind them, the house felt larger, emptier. Someone sighed, someone else shook their head. My wife turned to me then, her eyes searching my face. "You okay?" she asked. I nodded. For the first time that evening, it wasn't a performance. It was the truth.
After the door closed, no one rushed to fill the silence. The house settled into a strange stillness, like a room after a storm. Nothing visibly broken, yet everything subtly out of place. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen sounded louder now. Someone reached to turn off the music that had been playing softly in the background, as if it no longer belonged. People began to move, but without purpose. Plates were stacked even though dessert hadn't been finished.
Cups were collected, then set back down, forgotten. The family hovered in small clusters, avoiding the center of the room, avoiding the memory that hung there. What had happened couldn't be undone, but it also couldn't be addressed directly. It existed now as something everyone carried differently. My wife's brother stood near the window, staring outside without seeing anything. His shoulders sagged in a way I had never seen before, the posture of someone replaying a conversation too late. Every so often he rubbed his hands together, as if trying to warm them. An aunt approached him, speaking quietly. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. Her expression carried that familiar mix of concern and restraint, comfort without confrontation. He nodded, though his eyes remained distant. Across the room, a cousin glanced at me, then looked away, then back again. She finally approached, stopping a few steps short. "I didn't realize," she said softly. It wasn't a full apology, but it was closer than I'd expected. "Things got out of hand." I nodded once. Nothing more was needed. Apologies offered to soothe guilt rarely helped the person who endured the harm. My wife stayed close to me, her presence steady, grounding. She hadn't said much since the confrontation, but I could feel her processing everything. The evening, the years that led up to it, the patterns she'd grown up thinking were normal. She leaned in slightly. "They'll talk about this later," she murmured. "I know," I replied. They always did. Family discussions happened in echoes, long after the moment had passed, stripped of urgency but heavy with revision. Stories would be retold, softened, reframed. Motives would be assigned. Blame redistributed carefully so no one had to hold too much of it. I would become quieter in those retellings, less central, easier to manage. But something had already changed. I saw it in how people looked at me now, longer, more thoughtfully. I was no longer just the quiet one. I was the man who had said nothing until it mattered, the man who had disrupted the balance without raising his voice. That unsettled them. The girlfriend's absence was felt in small ways. No one filled the space she had occupied. Her chair remained empty, slightly pulled back from the table, like a reminder no one wanted to move. My wife's brother finally turned from the window and walked over, stopping in front of me. He hesitated, then spoke. "I didn't know," he said. It wasn't clear what he meant, what exactly he hadn't known. Her exaggerations, her behavior, or the way the family treated me when someone else gave them permission to. "I should have noticed," he added. I met his eyes. He looked tired, embarrassed, stripped of the certainty he'd worn earlier. "It's not easy to see things when you're proud of them," I said gently. He nodded, swallowing. "Still." We stood there for a moment, the unspoken weight between us. Then he stepped back, the conversation unfinished but no longer necessary. Gradually, people began to leave. Goodbyes were quieter, less performative. Hugs were shorter. Promises to meet again sounded tentative, like questions rather than statements. As we gathered our things, my wife's aunt touched my arm briefly. "You handled yourself well," she said. There was sincerity in her voice, and something else, recognition. I thanked her, though the words felt inadequate. Being told you handled mistreatment well is its own kind of irony. Outside, the night air was cool, steady. The streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement. My wife exhaled deeply as we walked to the car, as if she'd been holding her breath all evening. "I'm sorry," she said suddenly, "for not stopping it sooner." I took her hand. "You didn't cause it." "But I let it happen." I squeezed her fingers. "We both did, until we didn't." She nodded, tears glistening but unshed. As we drove away, the house grew smaller in the rearview mirror. Inside it, conversations would continue, opinions would shift, loyalties would realign.
But for me, something had settled. I no longer felt the need to prove anything. The room had rearranged itself, and I was no longer carrying the weight of its comfort. Some truths, once revealed, don't demand anything more. They simply change the way everyone stands.
The days after the dinner unfolded quietly, but the silence was deceptive. Nothing dramatic followed, no angry messages, no apologies delivered with urgency. Instead, there were pauses, delays, conversations that almost happened and then didn't. The family group chat, once lively, slowed to a trickle. Messages were shorter now, careful. Jokes landed without enthusiasm. When plans were suggested, responses came late or not at all. The energy that once kept everything moving had fractured, and no one knew how to repair it without acknowledging why it had broken. My wife noticed it before I did. "They're being different," she said one evening, scrolling through her phone. "Polite, like they're afraid of saying the wrong thing." "They are," I replied. Politeness is what replaces familiarity when people realize they've crossed a line they can't unsee. I wasn't mentioned directly in any of the conversations, but I was present in all of them, an unspoken reference point. The quiet man who hadn't been so quiet after all. The reminder that assumptions had consequences. A few days later, my wife's brother called. He didn't speak immediately when my wife answered, as if gathering courage. When he finally did, his voice sounded older. He ended things. She closed her eyes, listening. I could only hear fragments, but I didn't need details. Some endings don't require explanation. "She wasn't honest," he continued. "Not just about work, about how she treats people." There was a pause. Then, softer, "I should have seen it." After the call ended, my wife sat quietly for a long moment. "You didn't break them up," she said finally. "I know, but you changed something." I thought about that, about cause and effect, about how easy it is to carry blame for truths that simply existed before you spoke them. I didn't change her. I just stopped making it easy for her. That night, messages began to arrive. Not apologies exactly, more like acknowledgments. A cousin sent a note saying she'd been thinking a lot about the dinner. An aunt asked how I was doing, genuinely. Small gestures, tentative and cautious, but real. I responded politely, briefly. I didn't reopen the evening. I didn't demand remorse. I let them approach the truth at their own pace. Over time, the atmosphere shifted again, not back to what it had been, but into something quieter and more deliberate. At gatherings, people spoke with more awareness. Jokes softened. Conversations slowed when I entered, not out of fear, but attention. It was strange being noticed this way. My wife's relationship with her family changed too. She became more vocal, more willing to challenge small slights before they grew large. She no longer glanced at me nervously when conversations edged toward discomfort. One afternoon, as we walked together, she said, "I didn't realize how much I'd learned to stay quiet." Neither had I. The absence of the girlfriend lingered like a footnote everyone pretended not to read. Her name wasn't spoken. Her seat at future gatherings was never mentioned. She had exited the family narrative cleanly, efficiently. And yet her presence remained, not as a person, but as a lesson. The family had seen how easily cruelty could disguise itself as charm, how quickly they'd joined in, how silence had been mistaken for consent. That awareness couldn't be undone. Weeks later, at another dinner, someone made a joke that hovered too close to the edge. The room fell quiet for a moment.
Someone else cleared their throat. "That's not fair," my wife's cousin said gently. The moment passed. The conversation moved on. I sat back, listening. The change wasn't dramatic, it wasn't announced, but it was real. Later that night, as we drove home, my wife reached for my hand. She said, "I'm proud of you." "For what?" "For knowing when to speak." I smiled faintly. For knowing when not to. Silence, I had learned, wasn't a weakness. It was a choice, and choices, when made deliberately, carry weight long after the moment passes. The echoes of that dinner would fade eventually. All moments do. But the understanding it left behind, the reshaping of how respect was measured, how voices were weighed, would remain. Not loud, just present. And sometimes, that was enough.
Time did what it always does. It smoothed the sharpest edges without erasing the shape of what had happened. The family gatherings resumed, cautiously at first, then with more ease, though never quite the same as before. Something fragile had been acknowledged, and once seen, it could not be unseen. At the next dinner, the atmosphere felt lighter, but also more deliberate. Conversations no longer rushed to fill silence. People paused, listened, considered. It wasn't courtesy born of fear, it was awareness. I noticed the difference immediately. When I spoke, heads turned, not automatically, not performatively, but with genuine attention. When I stayed quiet, no one filled the space for me. The silence was allowed to exist, unjudged. My wife sat beside me, relaxed in a way she hadn't been before. She no longer scanned the room anxiously, anticipating discomfort. She spoke freely now, interrupting when she needed to, laughing without restraint. The shift had freed her, too. My wife's brother arrived alone. He looked steadier than he had in weeks, as though shedding a layer had allowed him to stand straighter. He greeted me with a nod that lingered longer than usual. "Good to see you." "Likewise." There was no awkwardness in it, just an understanding that didn't need to be explained. As the evening unfolded, stories were shared, memories surfaced, laughter came, this time without an edge. The family was finding a new rhythm, one that didn't rely on someone being smaller so others could feel large. At one point, my wife's aunt raised a topic that might once have spiraled: career comparisons, ambitions, success. She spoke carefully, framing it as curiosity rather than hierarchy. People answered honestly, some with pride, some with humility, some with uncertainty. All of it was allowed. I listened, contributing when it felt natural. No one interrupted me. No one dismissed my words. Respect had settled into the room not as a demand, but as a shared agreement. Later, as dishes were cleared, my wife's cousin leaned over and whispered, "You know, we never really noticed how unfair things were." I smiled faintly. Most people don't until something interrupts the pattern. She nodded, thoughtful. Outside, the night had grown cool. Conversations drifted onto the porch, where people stood in loose circles, talking quietly. The intimacy felt earned rather than enforced. My wife's brother joined me near the railing. "I've been thinking a lot about how easily I mistook confidence for character. It's a common mistake." He exhaled slowly. "I won't make it again." I believed him, not because he promised, but because he sounded changed by the realization. As the evening drew to a close, goodbyes were unhurried. There was no rush to escape, no tension to outrun. People lingered, finishing conversations, making plans. In the car on the way home, my wife rested her head against the window, watching the lights pass. "It feels balanced now," she said. "That's because it is."
balance wasn't about control or dominance. It was about mutual recognition, the understanding that everyone in the room carried weight and no one needed to be diminished for others to feel secure. That night, lying in bed, I reflected on how small the moment had been that changed everything. A phone on a table, a truth revealed without anger. Power, I realized, didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply refused to participate in falsehood. The family would continue to evolve. Old habits would resurface occasionally. No transformation was permanent without effort. But something foundational had shifted. I no longer braced myself before entering those rooms. I no longer rehearsed silence as a survival strategy. I simply arrived as myself, trusting that my presence no longer justified impunity. And if one day it did again, I knew now what to do. Not rush, not shout, just stand still, speak when necessary, and let truth rebalance the room on its own.
The days after that dinner carried a quiet clarity. Life returned to its usual rhythm, but something had changed in the background, a subtle undercurrent of awareness in the way people treated one another. It wasn't something anyone announced, it was simply felt, like sunlight filtering differently through familiar windows. At home, my wife and I found ourselves speaking more openly than we had in weeks. Not about the family, not about the dinner itself, but about the patterns we noticed in the world around us, the expectations people place on each other, and how easily silence can be mistaken for weakness. "I've been thinking," she said one evening as we sat at the kitchen table, the quiet hum of the refrigerator filling the room, "about how often I held back, how much I let things slide to avoid conflict." I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. We learn to accommodate, to stay quiet so others remain comfortable, but comfort often comes at a cost. She reached across the table, taking my hand in hers. Her fingers were warm, her grip firm. "I realized tonight that it's not just about speaking up, it's about choosing what matters enough to speak for." Her words resonated deeply. The dinner had been a lesson, but not just for the family. It had been a mirror reflecting how we navigate power, control, and respect in the world. Some lessons are loud, dramatic. Others are quiet, unfolding in reflection long after the moment has passed. We talked late into the night about patience, about timing, about endurance, about the strange and delicate power of simply observing before acting. I told her what I'd felt at the table, how I measured each moment, each word, each glance. She listened, her eyes thoughtful, unguarded. "You were incredible," she said softly. "I don't know if I could have done that." I shook my head. It wasn't courage, it was calculation, and patience. I waited until the moment mattered, until speaking wasn't about proving myself, but about letting reality speak for itself. She leaned her head against my shoulder. "You made me see something too, about how I approach everything, about compromise, about protecting others at my own expense." I smiled faintly. Sometimes the best protection isn't intervention, it's perspective. Over the next few weeks, we noticed small changes ripple outward. Conversations at family gatherings became more honest. People listened more. People paused before speaking. The room, once skewed by assumptions and unchallenged hierarchies, now held more balance. The girlfriend's absence was never directly mentioned, but it lingered as a quiet caution. No one claimed victory, no one gloated, but the lessons she inadvertently delivered were impossible to ignore. My wife and I often replayed moments from that evening, not with bitterness, but with reflection. How easily confidence can mask insecurity, how quickly charm can disguise disrespect, how silence can carry power if wielded deliberately. One evening, as we watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in warm hues, my wife whispered, "I feel free." "Free?" I asked. "From fear," she said,
from needing to anticipate everyone else's reactions, from carrying other people's comfort as my responsibility. I held her hand tighter. That's what balance feels like. We sat together in silence, letting the lessons settle. There was no triumph in it, no performance, just clarity, just understanding. It occurred to me then that the story wasn't about humiliation or confrontation. It was about revelation, seeing people as they truly are, understanding the dynamics they rely on, and knowing when to intervene and when to wait. And for the first time in a long time, I realized that enduring something quietly, observing without retaliation, and acting at the right moment carries a power that can't be measured by applause or acknowledgement. The reflection extended beyond family. It became a principle we carried into daily life, relationships, work, friendships, a reminder that people reveal themselves not only in what they say, but in how they react when confronted with truth. That night, lying in bed with my wife beside me, I felt an unfamiliar lightness. The weight of expectation, of anticipation, of discomfort had lifted. It hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had been redistributed in a way that no longer threatened us. I closed my eyes, thinking about the dinner, the phone, the silent recalibration of a room that at once seemed impossible to navigate. I thought about patience, timing, and the quiet power of enduring until the right moment. And I understood something essential. Life doesn't always reward the loud, the forceful, or the confrontational. Sometimes it rewards those who wait, observe, and act with clarity when the moment is truly meaningful. My wife stirred, murmuring softly, and I squeezed her hand. "We're ready," I whispered, though neither of us needed to clarify what that meant. For the first time, the past evening felt more than a memory. It was a lesson, a foundation, a turning point that had quietly reshaped how we approached the world, how we understood power, and how we measured respect. And in that moment, I knew that balance, patience, and quiet strength were gifts we would carry forward, together. If you want, I can write Chapter 12, the final chapter, as a reflective conclusion that closes the story and ties together the long-term impact of that night. Chapter 12. Closure. The weeks that followed settled into something resembling normalcy, though normal itself had shifted. Family gatherings no longer carried the same undertone of performance or expectation. Conversations flowed more deliberately. Laughter came more freely but carefully, not forced, not at someone else's expense. The room had learned a new rhythm, and I no longer felt like an outsider or a target. My wife and I attended these dinners differently now. We weren't cautious observers, waiting for the next slight. We weren't silent participants absorbing the discomfort of others. We were present, engaged, and quietly confident. Our presence was not a negotiation. It was a statement that respect could not be coerced, but must be acknowledged. It struck me how subtle the shift had been. No one announced it, no one drew attention to it, and yet everyone felt it. Eyes lingered longer when I spoke. Conversations paused to allow my perspective to be heard. My wife's brother, once quick to defend her new girlfriend's arrogance, now paused thoughtful before responding to any boast or exaggerated story. The dynamics had quietly rearranged themselves, and for the first time, balance was not just theoretical, but tangible. One afternoon, my wife and I were walking through a park near our home. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the path. She squeezed my hand, her expression reflective. "I've realized something," she said. "It wasn't just about that dinner or her behavior. It was how we let others define our place in the room, how we let silence feel like submission, how we let other people's insecurities dictate our own confidence." I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. We learn to accommodate, to stay quiet so others remain comfortable, but comfort often comes at a cost. She reached across the table, squeezing her hand in mine. She smiled faintly. And sometimes the best protection isn't intervention, it's perspective. Over the next few weeks, we noticed small changes ripple outward. Conversations at family gatherings became more honest. People listened more. People paused before speaking. The room, once skewed by assumptions and unchallenged hierarchies, now held more balance. The girlfriend's absence was never directly mentioned, but it lingered as a quiet caution. No one claimed victory, no one gloated, but the lessons she inadvertently delivered were impossible to ignore. My wife and I often replayed moments from that evening, not with bitterness, but with reflection. How easily confidence can mask insecurity, how quickly charm can disguise disrespect, how silence can carry power if wielded deliberately. One evening, as we watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in warm hues, my wife whispered, "I feel free." "Free?" I asked. "From fear," she said, "from needing to anticipate everyone else's reactions, from carrying other people's comfort as my responsibility." I held her hand tighter. That's what balance feels like. We sat together in silence, letting the lessons settle. There was no triumph in it, no performance, just clarity, just understanding. It occurred to me then that the story wasn't about humiliation or confrontation. It was about revelation, seeing people as they truly are, understanding the dynamics they rely on, and knowing when to intervene and when to wait. And for the first time in a long time, I realized that enduring something quietly, observing without retaliation, and acting at the right moment carries a power that can't be measured by applause or acknowledgement. The reflection extended beyond family. It became a principle we carried into daily life, relationships, work, friendships, a reminder that people reveal themselves not only in what they say, but in how they react when confronted with truth. That night, lying in bed with my wife beside me, I felt an unfamiliar lightness, the weight of expectation, of anticipation, of discomfort.